Memory doesn't ask for permission. It arrives quietly, folded into ordinary moments, then stays longer than it should. Sometimes it isn't the truth we remember. It's the feeling. Years later, you won't remember every word that was said, but you will remember how your chest tightened. You will remember the silence. You will remember the door closing, and you will replay it over and over, wondering where everything went wrong. This is not a story about betrayal. It's a story about how memory can turn fear into a lie, and a lie into life-altering mistake. Have you ever said, "I'm fine," when you weren't? Not to deceive, but to survive. Have you ever pushed someone away because their fear didn't look like yours? Tonight's story begins on the worst night of her life. A night she will remember not for what she said, but for what she didn't. She was pregnant. The storm was unforgiving. And a man she loved didn't shout, didn't plead, didn't hesitate. He simply told her to leave. But here's the truth most people don't talk about. The moment that ends a marriage rarely begins there. It begins years earlier. In childhood memories that taught us what love costs, in quiet habits we develop to feel safe, and in the fear that if we are truly honest, we will be abandoned. Welcome to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson. If you believe love is shaped as much by memory as it is by choice, consider subscribing, because these are not fairy tales. These are stories about real people, real mistakes, and real lessons. Stay with me, because by the end of this story, you'll understand why she lied, why he couldn't forgive it, and how memory almost destroyed them both. And it all begins with a woman folding baby clothes, trying to convince herself that order still existed somewhere in her life. She folded the tiny white onesies the same way every morning. Left sleeve over right, bottom tucked in. Her hands smoothed the fabric twice before stacking it neatly in the drawer. It was a small ritual, almost insignificant, but she treated it with care, as if precision could protect her, as if order, any order, meant something was still under her control. The room smelled faintly of lavender from the sachet she had bought months earlier, during a time when the future felt cooperative. Back when plans didn't feel fragile. Back when she believed effort guaranteed safety. That morning, her hands trembled. She tried to steady them, inhaling slowly, counting her breath the way the doctor had suggested. 1, 2, 3. But the shaking didn't stop. It moved up her arms, settled in her chest like a low hum of panic she'd grown used to ignoring. She paused and pressed one palm gently against her stomach. For a moment, there was nothing. Her heart tightened. Then came the familiar flutter, soft, unmistakable. A quiet reassurance from inside her body, as if something smaller and braver than her was reminding her to keep going. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Waiting. That was what her life had become. Waiting for reassurance. Waiting for forgiveness. Waiting for him to notice what she didn't know how to say out loud. She closed the drawer slowly, careful not to make a sound. The house was still. Too still, the kind of quiet that made every thought louder. Down the hall, the door to their bedroom was ajar. Light spilled across the carpet. She could hear him moving, measured footsteps, the rustle of fabric. He always moved with purpose, even at home, as if rest required intention. Once, that had comforted her. Lately, it made her feel watched. She leaned against the dresser, her fingers brushing the edge of a framed photo. The two of them, taken years ago, neither smiling widely, just standing close, shoulders touching. It had been one of the first things she loved about him, how he never performed happiness, how he believed quiet contentment mattered more than display. They hadn't fallen in love loudly. They had settled into it. She remembered those early days clearly, or at least she remembered how they felt. Memory had a way of polishing certain moments, sanding down the uncertainty that once lived inside them. They met in a room full of people who spoke too loudly about things that didn't matter. Success stories delivered with forced laughter. Compliments that sounded like transactions. She had gone because she felt she was supposed to, because adulthood had taught her that showing up was safer than opting out. He had stood near the window, hands in his pockets, watching rain streak down the glass like it held answers. She noticed that before anything else. Not the tailored suit, not the quiet authority in the way others deferred to him, but the distance in his eyes, the look of someone who had learned early not to expect much. When they spoke, it was slow, careful, as if neither of them wanted to scare the other away with enthusiasm. They talked about bad coffee, about how strange it felt to wake up one day and realize life hadn't turned out the way you imagined, but you were still expected to be grateful. They laughed softly, not because things were funny, but because it was a relief to say them out loud. It wasn't attraction that pulled her toward him. It was recognition. He listened in a way that felt rare. Not the kind of listening that waited for its turn to speak, but the kind that treated her words like fragile objects, things that could be mishandled if you weren't careful. And in his silence, she sensed something familiar, a man shaped by absence. Parents who loved him with expectations instead of warmth. A childhood where success was praised and fear was dismissed, where vulnerability was a liability. She saw it not because he told her, but because she recognized the pattern. Her own father had taught her something similar, though in a different language. Love that receded when things became inconvenient. Affection that cooled at the first sign of discomfort. She had learned young that fear made people leave. So she learned not to show it. When they began spending time together, there were no dramatic gestures, no declarations, just consistency, shared meals, Evenings spent in comfortable silence. The quiet intimacy of knowing someone would still be there in the morning. That steadiness felt like safety. When he proposed, it wasn't during a trip or a party. It happened at the kitchen table, late at night, when the world felt small and manageable. He asked the question softly, almost unsure, as if he needed permission to hope. She said yes, because it felt like choosing peace. She didn't yet understand how much safety terrified him. Pregnancy changed the rhythm of the house, not dramatically, not in ways other people would notice. There were no arguments, no slammed doors, just a subtle shift, like a song played in a slightly different key. He watched her more closely, asked more questions, paused when she moved too quickly. His concern came out sideways, expressed through control instead of comfort. She mistook his silence for indifference. He mistook her silence for deception. The doctor's appointment was the first crack. She had gone alone, telling herself it wasn't a big deal, that she would explain later, once she understood everything better, once the fear made sense. When he asked how it went, she smiled. "Everything's fine," she said. It wasn't a complete lie, but it wasn't the truth either. She didn't tell him about the risk, about the warning, about the way the doctor's voice softened when discussing possibilities no one wanted to name. She didn't tell him how fear sat in her chest like a held breath, how every flutter felt like both reassurance and threat, because somewhere deep inside her, memory whispered the same old lesson. Fear makes people leave. So she chose silence. Again, the storm came that evening, without warning. Rain battered the windows. Thunder rolled through the house like it had been waiting for permission to speak. The sky cracked open, loud and unforgiving. She was in the bedroom when he stood in the doorway, holding her phone. "You went to the doctor without telling me," he said. His voice wasn't raised. That was what frightened her most. She opened her mouth to explain, but memory interfered. Her mother crying quietly in the kitchen. Promises that didn't survive discomfort. The familiar tightening in her throat. "I didn't want to worry you," she said. His jaw tightened. "So you lied." The word landed heavier than the thunder outside. To him, lies were not about facts. They were about abandonment, about being excluded from the truth, about being made unnecessary. "You decided I couldn't handle it," he said. "You decided for me," she tried to explain. But fear has a way of shrinking language. The more she spoke, the more he heard echoes of every withheld truth he'd grown up with. When he told her to leave, his voice was steady, almost practiced. The rain soaked her before she reached the gate. She didn't cry until she was gone. And years from now, When memory returned, it wouldn't bring back the storm, or the words, or even the lie. It would bring back the feeling, the moment everything broke. Quietly, the rain followed her long after she left the gate. It soaked into her clothes, her hair, her thoughts. By the time she reached the car, she couldn't tell what part of her was cold from the storm and what part was cold from shock. Her hands shook as she reached for the door handle, pausing there as if some invisible force might pull her back. It didn't. The engine started on the second try. She sat there for a moment, forehead resting against the steering wheel, listening to the rain drum against the windshield. Each drop felt like punctuation, marking the end of something she hadn't realized was so fragile. Memory was already working. It didn't replay the argument in full sentences. It offered fragments. The shape of his mouth when the word, lied. The way his eyes didn't soften. The steadiness of his voice when he told her to leave, as if he had rehearsed the possibility long before it happened. She pulled onto the road slowly, her body moving on instinct while her mind lagged behind, trying to catch up. The world outside blurred into streaks of light and shadow. Every familiar street felt suddenly unfamiliar, like she was driving through someone else's life. Her phone buzzed once. She didn't look. Hope was dangerous in moments like this. She knew that. Hope had tricked her before, had convinced her that silence could be mistaken for strength, that endurance would be rewarded. She placed one hand on her stomach again, grounding herself in the present. The baby shifted faintly, a reminder that whatever had just happened didn't erase responsibility. It didn't erase love either. Not the kind that lived beyond romance. Okay, she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was saying it to. Okay. She stayed with a friend that night. A woman who didn't ask too many questions, who offered dry clothes and tea and a couch without commentary. That kindness, unremarkable to most people, felt enormous to her. It felt like proof that the world hadn't closed entirely. Sleep didn't come easily. Every time she closed her eyes, memory rearranged the evening. It asked questions she didn't have answers for yet. What if you'd told him sooner? What if you'd chosen honesty instead of protection? What if fear hadn't spoken first? Morning arrived quietly, as if it didn't want to intrude. She woke to gray light and the unfamiliar ceiling above her. For a moment, she forgot where she was. And then it all came rushing back. The storm, the words she couldn't take back. Her body ached with exhaustion, but her mind was sharp, restless. She sat up slowly, one hand braced against her lower back, and stared out the window. Rain still fell, softer now, almost apologetic. She wondered what he was doing. That question surprised her. Even now, even after being sent away, part of her was still oriented toward him, still waiting, still listening for cues, like she always had. Waiting had been her longest habit. In the house she had left behind, he stood alone in the kitchen, staring at a mug he hadn't realized he was holding. The storm had quieted, but something inside him hadn't. The silence felt louder than the thunder had. It pressed against his ears, his chest, his thoughts. He told himself he had done the right thing. Boundaries mattered. Trust mattered. He had learned that early, learned it the hard way. When people withheld truth, it meant they didn't believe you could handle reality. It meant you were expendable. He set the mug down with more force than necessary. The house looked the same, but it felt altered. Like a room after someone moves furniture, and your body hasn't adjusted yet. Her scarf lay draped over the chair. A pair of shoes waited by the door. Evidence of her presence everywhere. Evidence he hadn't erased. Not yet. He moved through the space methodically, as if completing a checklist. Lock the door. Turn off the lights. Close the windows. Control had always been his way of calming himself. But memory resisted order. It offered him moments he hadn't asked for. Her laughter, quiet and unguarded. The way she hummed when folding laundry. The care she took with small things. Plants, routines, details most people rushed past. He remembered the morning she told him she was pregnant. Not the announcement itself, but what followed. How she watched his face carefully, as if measuring his reaction. How he had nodded, said the right things, kept his voice even. He hadn't known how to hold joy without bracing for loss. That realization unsettled him. He sat at the table where he had proposed, hands resting flat against the wood, the same table where he had asked a question that had changed both their lives. He wondered, not for the first time, whether he had mistaken stability for certainty, whether he had believed love was safest when it was predictable. His phone buzzed. He glanced at it, then away. Distance, he told himself, was necessary. Space created clarity. That was what people said. That was what he'd always believed. Still, his chest felt tight. Days passed. For her, time stretched unevenly. Some hours slipped by unnoticed. Others dragged with painful clarity. She attended her appointments, followed instructions, took care of what needed to be taken care of. On the surface, she was functioning. Inside, memory kept rearranging the story. Sometimes it softened him, reminded her of the way he listened, the way he stayed. Other times, it sharpened the moment of rejection, replaying it with brutal precision. Memory, she learned, was not loyal. It served the emotion of the moment. She drafted messages she didn't send, explanations, apologies, confessions she wished she'd made earlier. Each one felt both necessary and impossible. She told herself she would speak when she was stronger. That thought scared her. It sounded too familiar. For him, the house became unbearable. He found himself pausing in doorways, forgetting what he had gone there to do. Objects triggered recollections he didn't know how to process. The baby clothes in the drawer, the lavender scent lingering in the bedroom. He opened the drawer one evening without thinking. The folded onesies stared back at him. Precise, careful, loved. He picked one up, surprised by how small it was, how deliberate her hands must have been. A memory surfaced, uninvited. Her standing by the dresser, one hand pressed to her stomach, eyes closed as if listening. He hadn't asked what she was afraid of. That omission unsettled him more than the lie. He sat on the edge of the bed, the fabric soft between his fingers, and felt something crack. Not dramatically, just enough to let doubt in. What if she hadn't been trying to deceive you? What if she had been trying to survive? He didn't like where those questions led. Memory doesn't arrive all at once. It drips in slowly, reshaping certainty into curiosity, turning judgment into reflection. For both of them, the story they told themselves about that night began to change, not because facts had changed, but because understanding had. And somewhere between distance and longing, between silence and regret, a truth waited patiently to be acknowledged. The lie had ended the night, but fear had written the story long before that. If this story made you stop and think, even for a moment, like the video, so it can reach someone else who may need it, and tell me in the comments, was the lie the real mistake? Or was it the fear behind it? Stay with me, because in the next chapter, memory begins to change everything. Memory has a way of pretending it's a witness. It speaks with confidence. It insists it was there, that it saw everything clearly. But memory isn't a recorder. It's a storyteller, one shaped by fear, longing, and the need to make sense of pain. That was something neither of them understood yet. For her, memory always returned to the same place. A small kitchen. Late evening, the hum of the refrigerator, filling the silence her parents never addressed. She would sit at the table, feet dangling, watching her mother move slowly between sink and stove, wiping already clean counters, waiting for her father to come home in a good mood, waiting to see which version of him would walk through the door. He wasn't cruel. That was the confusing part. He never raised his voice, never struck anyone. He simply withdrew when life asked too much of him, when bills piled up, when work disappointed him, when emotions demanded effort. Love in that house was conditional on ease. If things were calm, he stayed. If things were hard, he disappeared into silence, into work, into himself. She learned early that fear made people leave. So she learned to manage fear quietly. She learned to smile when she was uncertain, to say it's fine when it wasn't, to become low maintenance, agreeable, easy to stay with. She mistook endurance for strength because endurance was rewarded. By the time she became an adult, silence felt responsible, protective, mature. Honesty, on the other hand, felt dangerous. For him, memory sounded different. His childhood home was orderly, impressive, calm in a way that felt rehearsed. Emotions were discussed the way finances were, efficiently, without mess. Praise arrived when achievements did. Affection followed performance. He learned how to succeed early, learned how to lead, learned how to remain composed no matter what he felt. What he never learned was how to ask for help. Vulnerability wasn't forbidden. It was simply ignored. Fear wasn't punished. It was dismissed. If something hurt, the solution was to work harder, be smarter, be stronger. Dependence was weakness. Needing reassurance was failure. And above all, exclusion was unbearable. Because to be left out of the truth, to discover something after the fact, meant you weren't trusted, meant you weren't necessary, meant you were already being left behind. He told himself he valued honesty above all else. What he really feared was being made irrelevant. When they found each other, these lessons collided quietly. At first, it felt like balance. Her softness steadied him. His certainty grounded her. She admired how he didn't fall apart. He admired how she didn't demand. They mistook compatibility for healing. In the beginning, her silence felt like peace. His control felt like safety. Neither of them asked where those instincts came from. They built a relationship on what didn't trigger old wounds and called it love. But memory is patient. It waits until the stakes are high enough to speak. Pregnancy had raised the stakes. Suddenly, fear wasn't theoretical. It lived in test results and hushed tones and careful instructions. It lived in her body, in the way she woke at night, counting movements, in the way she listened for reassurance she didn't know how to ask for. Her instinct told her to contain the fear. His instinct told him to monitor it. Neither realized they were reacting to ghosts. When she chose silence, she believed she was protecting the relationship, protecting him, protecting herself. When he discovered the omission, he didn't see fear. He saw exclusion. Memory rushed in to fill the gaps, and memory is rarely kind. The night of the storm didn't feel sudden to him, not emotionally. It felt inevitable, as if a line had been crossed that had always been waiting to be tested. But what memory didn't show him yet was this. She hadn't lied because she didn't trust him. She lied because she didn't trust love to survive fear. And what memory didn't show her yet was this. He hadn't sent her away because he didn't love her. He did it because love had made him feel powerless, and he didn't know how to stay in that feeling. Two people reacting perfectly to the wrong lessons. Two children still trying to protect themselves. And memory, quietly taking notes, preparing to rewrite the story later. At first, their relationship felt unusually calm. There were no emotional swings, no dramatic confrontations, no loud reconciliations that required apologies and flowers. What they had felt, mature, balanced, something people admired from the outside. Friends described them as solid. She liked that word. Solid meant dependable. Solid meant unshakable. Solid meant no one would suddenly decide it was all too much and walk away. He liked it too, for different reasons. Solid meant predictable. It meant contained. It meant love that didn't ask him to reach for feelings he didn't have language for. They built their days carefully. Mornings were quiet. Evenings followed routines that felt earned. Dinners at the same time, familiar conversations, shared silences that didn't demand explanation. When disagreements surfaced, they were handled efficiently. He offered solutions. She accepted them gratefully. Neither noticed what was missing. She rarely asked for reassurance. He rarely offered emotional softness. It worked until it didn't. Memory, again, played its part. When she felt uncertain, she reminded herself how steady he was, how he stayed, how he didn't disappear when life became complicated. That steadiness felt like proof. When he felt uncomfortable, he reminded himself how undemanding she was, how she didn't push, how she didn't need more than he could comfortably give. That restraint felt like respect. They both felt chosen, but being chosen for what you don't ask for has a cost. There were moments, small ones, when the cracks showed. She would hesitate before sharing something personal, watching his face for signs of impatience. When he responded calmly but distantly, she would retreat, telling herself it wasn't important anyway. He would notice her withdrawing, but wouldn't ask why. He believed space was considerate. That pressing for emotion was intrusive. He told himself that if something mattered, she would say it. They were both wrong, but memory, in its early stages, is forgiving. It excuses. It reframes. She told herself she was being independent. He told himself he was being respectful. And so the pattern solidified. Love deepened in ways that didn't require vulnerability. They traveled. They planned. They talked about the future in practical terms. Homes, schedules, responsibilities. They were good partners in the visible sense. They functioned well. When he proposed, it felt like a continuation rather than a leap. The night he asked her, the house was quiet. The question came softly, without spectacle. His voice carried uncertainty he didn't often allow himself. She saw it and mistook it for tenderness alone. She said yes because the life they had built felt safe. What she didn't recognize yet was that safety, for him, had limits, and what he didn't recognize yet was that her silence was not peace. It was fear carefully disguised. Marriage intensified what already existed. Responsibilities grew. Expectations shifted. The invisible contracts they had never discussed became heavier. He carried the weight of provision seriously. She carried the weight of emotional harmony. They loved each other sincerely, but sincerity doesn't cancel pattern. Pregnancy changed everything because it introduced uncertainty. Neither of them could manage the way they used to. Her body became a landscape of signals she couldn't control. Every sensation felt loaded with meaning. Fear followed her through the day, quiet but persistent. She wanted to tell him. She rehearsed the words in her head, standing in the shower, folding laundry, lying awake at night. But each time, memory interrupted. Her father's silence when her mother cried. The way tension had made love recede. The certainty that being too much was dangerous. So she waited. She told herself she would speak when she was sure. When fear could be packaged neatly. When it wouldn't disrupt the calm they had worked so hard to build. For him, pregnancy awakened a different unease. He felt responsible in a way that frightened him. Responsible not just for outcomes, but for emotions he didn't know how to regulate. He watched her closely, sensing something was off, but unsure how to approach it. Asking directly felt risky. What if she needed something he couldn't give? He chose observation over conversation, control over curiosity. Both of them were acting in ways that once protected them. Both of them were unknowingly preparing the ground for collapse. The doctor's appointment became the quiet turning point, not because of what happened there, but because of what it represented. She went alone, because that was what she had always done when she was afraid. He discovered it later because exclusion was the one thing memory had taught him to never tolerate. By the time the truth surfaced, memory had already rewritten intentions into accusations. She believed she had been careful. He believed she had been dishonest. And once memory frames a story, it resists revision. Years later, both of them would look back and see the warning signs clearly. The missed chances, the silences that should have been questioned, the comfort that hid the cracks. But at the time, all they knew was this: they loved each other. They believed they were doing the right thing, and they had no idea how much their past was still speaking for them. Love hadn't failed yet. Understanding had. There is a moment in every relationship when love stops being something you feel and starts becoming something you manage. Neither of them noticed when that shift happened. It arrived quietly, the way most important things do, wrapped in routine, disguised as responsibility. It came in shared calendars and grocery lists, in decisions made without discussion, because discussion felt unnecessary. They were good at functioning together. That became their pride. When people asked what made their marriage work, she would smile and say, "We don't overcomplicate things." He would nod and add, "We trust each other." Both statements were true. They just weren't complete. Marriage gave their lives structure. The house ran smoothly. Schedules were efficient. Conflicts were addressed quickly and practically. If something needed fixing, he fixed it. If something needed smoothing over, she did that too, often without being asked. She took pride in how little disruption she caused. He took pride in how much he provided. These roles weren't assigned. They were assumed. And assumption, when left unexamined, has a way of turning into obligation. She told herself she was being supportive, that keeping things calm was a form of love. When she swallowed disappointment or worry, she believed she was protecting what they had built. He told himself he was being dependable. That stability was the greatest gift he could offer. When he stayed composed, when he solved problems instead of sitting with them, he believed he was showing care. They rarely argued. On the surface, that looked like harmony. Underneath, it meant something else entirely. There were nights when she lay awake beside him, listening to his steady breathing, and wondered whether closeness always felt this quiet. She would turn slightly toward him, tempted to speak, to tell him about a fear that had followed her all day, or a thought she hadn't quite understood yet. But memory would intervene. Don't make things heavy. Don't disrupt the calm. Don't ask for what you're not sure he can give. So she stayed silent, and he, sensing movement but not meaning, would remain still. He believed space was respectful, that allowing someone their quiet was kindness. What neither of them realized was that silence was becoming their shared language, and neither of them was fluent enough to say what mattered most. Commitment, for him, meant permanence. He had chosen her. That choice was not casual. He didn't waver. He didn't look elsewhere. In his mind, loyalty was proven through consistency. He showed up. He provided. He stayed. What he didn't do was ask how she was changing, because change implied uncertainty, and uncertainty made him uneasy in ways he didn't like to examine. Commitment for her meant safety. It meant someone who wouldn't leave when things became complicated. Someone whose presence wasn't conditional on ease. She believed that if she could just remain steady enough, agreeable enough, the relationship would remain intact. So she adjusted herself. She became smaller where necessary, quieter when emotions rose, more careful with words that might create distance. She believed this was love, and love, as she understood it, required sacrifice. The day they learned she was pregnant, she felt a strange mixture of joy and fear. Joy Because the future suddenly felt real in a way it never had before. Fear. Because the future now depended on variables she couldn't control. She watched his reaction closely, searching for reassurance in his expression. He smiled, nodded, took a breath that looked measured, thoughtful. He did everything right. But memory noted what wasn't there. There was no visible fear, no vulnerability, no admission of uncertainty. He spoke about logistics, doctors, timelines, adjustments, things he could manage. She told herself that was just his way. He told himself he was being responsible. Neither said what they were actually feeling. Pregnancy introduced a new kind of intimacy, one that demanded honesty in ways they weren't prepared for. Her body no longer obeyed routine. Symptoms arrived unpredictably. Fear followed close behind. Every appointment carried weight. Every sensation felt symbolic. She wanted him to notice, but she didn't know how to ask without sounding fragile. And fragility, memory reminded her, was dangerous. So she offered updates that sounded reassuring. She minimized concerns. She chose words that would keep his voice calm, his posture relaxed. "I'm okay," became her reflex. For him, pregnancy sharpened his awareness. He noticed changes, the way she paused more often, the way her smile sometimes lagged behind her words. He felt responsible in a way that unsettled him. Responsible not just for outcomes, but for her emotional state. That kind of responsibility felt overwhelming. He didn't know how to sit with fear without trying to solve it. And because he couldn't solve what she wasn't saying, he grew more vigilant. He asked more questions, watched more closely, waited for information that never fully came. Control began to replace trust, not consciously, but gradually. They still loved each other. That was the tragedy of it. There was no malice, no intention to deceive or dominate. Just two people responding faithfully to lessons they had learned long before they met. Lessons that said love must be maintained carefully. Fear must be managed quietly. And vulnerability is a risk best avoided. The unspoken promises between them multiplied. She promised not to be too much. He promised not to lose control. Neither promise allowed room for honesty. And somewhere in that narrowing space, the truth began to feel unsafe. By the time the doctor's appointment arrived, the pattern was already set. She went alone because that was how she had always faced fear. He wasn't told because he had always expected inclusion. Neither of them recognized the moment as a turning point. But memory did. Memory always does. It records not just what happened, but what was meant. And meaning, once misread, has consequences. Expectation has a way of disguising itself as love. It doesn't arrive as a demand. It arrives as a belief, a quiet assumption that if two people care enough, they will naturally understand each other without being told, that they will know what is needed, what is feared, what must not be touched. Both of them believed this, and both of them were wrong. As the weeks passed, pregnancy settled into their lives like a presence that refused to be ignored. It showed up in small accommodations, extra pillows on the bed, changes in routine, meals adjusted without discussion. He was attentive in ways that made sense to him. Practical, efficient, protective. She noticed all of it. She appreciated it. But appreciation wasn't what she needed most. What she needed was permission to be afraid. She wanted him to ask questions that didn't come with solutions attached, to sit beside her uncertainty instead of standing over it, measuring risks and outcomes. But she didn't know how to say that without sounding ungrateful. So she smiled, thanked him, reassured him, and each time she did, an expectation solidified. He began to believe she was coping well, that her calm meant confidence, that his role was simply to maintain order and stability so she wouldn't have to worry. He didn't see the effort behind her composure. Memory, once again, filled in the gaps. In his mind, responsibility had rules. You gather information. You prepare for worst-case scenarios. You make decisions early so nothing spirals out of control. Uncertainty, to him, felt like negligence. So when he sensed something was being withheld, when her answers became shorter, when she avoided details, his discomfort grew. He didn't accuse her. Not yet. He told himself he was being patient, standing. But beneath that patience lived an unspoken demand. Tell me everything. He didn't articulate it, because articulation would require vulnerability. It would require admitting that not knowing made him afraid. And fear, memory reminded him, was not something you showed. So he waited, and waiting, when fueled by expectation, easily turns into suspicion. She felt the shift before she understood it. His questions became more frequent, more precise, less open-ended. She sensed the scrutiny in the way he watched her, the way his attention lingered just a moment too long. She mistook it for doubt. It made her retreat further. Each time she chose silence, she believed she was keeping the peace. Each time he noticed the silence, he believed something was being taken from him. They were now locked in a pattern where the very behaviors meant to protect the relationship were slowly eroding trust. There were moments when the truth hovered close. She would sit on the edge of the bed, phone in hand, reading and rereading messages from the doctor. Her heart would race, and she would consider walking into the next room and telling him everything, every fear, every possibility, every uncertainty. But memory intervened, sharp and convincing. What if this makes him pull away? What if he becomes distant, overwhelmed, disappointed? What if honesty costs you the one thing you're trying to protect. Fear framed honesty as a gamble. She folded the phone away. "I'm okay," she said again. He noticed the repetition. That phrase began to irritate him, not because it was false, but because it felt incomplete, too smooth, too rehearsed. It reminded him of conversations from his past, moments when truth arrived late, if at all. Memory whispered its own warnings. People lie when they don't trust you. They lie when they think you can't handle the truth. They lie when they are already halfway out the door. He didn't want to believe any of that. But belief is not always chosen. Sometimes it is inherited. Expectation hardened into assumption. Assumption hardened into resentment. And resentment, when unspoken, does its work quietly. They still shared meals, still exchanged affection, still slept beside each other at night. But something essential had shifted, not visibly, not dramatically, but emotionally. They were no longer responding to each other as they were. They were responding to memories, to old lessons, old fears, old stories about what love required and what it could survive. By the time the doctor's appointment arrived, the one she attended alone, the distance between intention and impact was already too wide to cross easily. She believed she was being careful. He would soon believe she was being dishonest. Neither of them yet understood that the real danger wasn't the omission itself, but the expectations that made honesty feel impossible. And this is the quiet truth most people never learn until it's too late. Love doesn't break at the moment of conflict. It weakens in the space where assumptions replace conversation. That space was widening now, and neither of them knew how to close it. Fear changes shape when it has nowhere to go. At first it sits quietly, asking for attention in subtle ways. A tight chest, a restless night, a question that lingers just beyond language. But when it's ignored long enough, fear doesn't disappear. It grows. For her, fear became physical. It lived in the pauses between movements, in the way she woke before dawn and lay still, counting breaths and flutters. It followed her through the day, shadowing even the smallest decisions. What she ate, how fast she walked, how long she stood. Pregnancy had stripped her of the illusion that control was permanent, and memory, ever watchful, reminded her of what happened when fear was made visible. So she carried it alone. She told herself this was temporary, that once things stabilized, once the doctor sounded more confident, once the risk passed, she would explain everything. She rehearsed how calm she would sound, how reasonable her words would be. She wanted the truth to arrive already softened. What she didn't realize was that waiting was reshaping the truth itself. He sensed the shift more clearly now. It was no longer just a feeling. It was pattern. The way she deflected certain questions. The way her answers grew careful, curated. The way she smiled a second too late. He began paying closer attention. not out of distrust, at least not consciously, but out of a growing unease he couldn't quite name. He checked his phone more often, adjusted his schedule without explaining why, asked about appointments even when he already knew the dates. Control crept in quietly, disguised as concern. He told himself he was being responsible, that vigilance was part of love, that noticing details meant he cared. But underneath that care lived fear he didn't want to face, the fear that something important was happening without him. And exclusion, to him, felt like the beginning of loss. The house began to feel smaller, not physically, but emotionally. Conversations grew functional, necessary, safe. They talked about groceries, logistics, appointments that had already happened or were far enough away to feel manageable. They avoided the present tense. The present required honesty. She wanted him to ask her how she felt, not how she was doing. She wanted him to sit beside her uncertainty instead of hovering at the edges of it. He wanted her to tell him what was happening without being prompted. He wanted inclusion without having to request it. To him, needing to ask felt like failure. Neither asked for what they needed. Both waited to be understood. The day of the doctor's appointment arrived quietly. She woke before him, careful not to disturb his sleep. She moved slowly, deliberately, the way you do when you're trying not to leave evidence. In the bathroom mirror, she barely recognized herself. Her eyes looked older, more guarded. She told herself she would call him afterward, that she would explain everything once she had clarity. The appointment room was bright and sterile. The doctor's voice was calm, measured, practiced. He spoke of risks without panic, of possibilities without certainty. He offered reassurance, but it came with conditions. She nodded, asked questions, took notes she would later reread obsessively. Fear settled deeper. On the drive home, she pulled over once, just to breathe. Her hands rested on the steering wheel, her head bowed, as if she were listening for guidance. This was the moment. This was when honesty should have arrived. But memory spoke louder than instinct. Don't make things heavier than they already are. Don't introduce fear before you have answers. Don't risk being seen as fragile. So, when she walked through the door later that afternoon, and he asked how it went, she smiled. "Everything's okay?" she said. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't the truth either. He heard the words and felt something tighten inside him. Okay had become a wall. He watched her closely as she moved through the room, noting the way she avoided his eyes, the way her hand lingered at her side instead of reaching for him. Memory rushed forward with its familiar warnings. When people stop telling you things, it's because they don't trust you. When they don't trust you, They are already preparing to leave. He didn't confront her. Not yet. He stored the feeling away, telling himself he was overreacting. That pregnancy was stressful, that he needed to be patient. But patience, when fueled by fear, is rarely generous. That night, sleep eluded them both. She lay awake, replaying the doctor's words, measuring every sensation in her body, wondering how long she could keep holding this alone. He lay awake too, listening to her breathing, sensing distance without understanding it, feeling a familiar resentment take root, not toward her, but toward the feeling of not knowing. Between them, silence stretched thin, and somewhere in that silence, the lie, small, fearful, unintentional, began to take on a weight it was never meant to carry. Silence does not stay neutral forever. It gathers meaning. It accumulates tension. And eventually, it demands interpretation. For him, that interpretation had begun to harden. He didn't want to believe she was hiding something. He resisted the thought at first, pushing it aside with logic and routine. He reminded himself of who she was, careful, considerate, steady. He told himself pregnancy changed people, that stress distorted perception. But memory is persuasive when it feels familiar. It showed him old scenes he hadn't asked to see, moments from a life before her, when information arrived late and consequences arrived early, when he had been the last to know, the one expected to adapt quietly, while everyone else adjusted without him. He hated that feeling, being unprepared, being excluded, being made unnecessary. So he began watching more closely, not spying, not yet, just noticing. The way she held her phone differently now, screen angled away. The way she stepped outside to take calls that once would have happened openly in the kitchen. The way she seemed relieved when he wasn't home. Each detail, harmless on its own, gathered weight in his mind. Fear is a collector. It hoards evidence. She felt the tension, too. She sensed it in his questions, which had become sharper without sounding accusatory. She noticed the way he paused after her answers, as if weighing them. She told herself she was imagining it, that she was projecting her own fear onto him. But her body knew better. She began choosing words carefully, rehearsing responses before speaking. She smiled more, offered reassurance without being asked. She tried to make herself legible, to appear calm, stable, reliable. It exhausted her. At night, she lay awake, one hand on her stomach, the other pressed into the mattress between them. She wanted to reach across that space, to tell him everything, to let the fear out where it could breathe. But the moment never felt right. Fear told her the truth needed better timing. Memory told her honesty could wait. And so did. The discovery did not happen dramatically. There was no shouting, no sudden revelation delivered with theatrical timing. It arrived quietly, the way most life-altering moments do. He was alone in the house that afternoon, working from home because meetings had been canceled. The rain had started again. Not a storm this time. Just a steady, persistent drizzle that blurred the windows. Her phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. He hadn't meant to look. That mattered to him later. That he hadn't gone searching. That the moment had found him instead. The screen lit up with a notification, a name he didn't recognize, a message preview that was impossible to ignore. Please remember to monitor. The rest cut off. His chest tightened. He stared at the phone longer than necessary, telling himself not to touch it, telling himself this was nothing. That curiosity was the enemy of trust. But trust, he realized in that moment, already felt compromised. He picked it up. The messages were clinical, measured, concerned in the way professionals are when they are trying not to alarm you. Mentions of follow-ups, of precautions, of monitoring risks that were not insignificant. Nothing scandalous, nothing immoral, nothing that justified what would happen next. But to him, the damage was already done. He felt it immediately. Not anger, but something colder, something steadier. The familiar sensation of being outside the circle of truth. She had gone to the doctor without him. She had received information that mattered, information about their child, and had chosen not to share it. Memory spoke loudly now, drowning out nuance. She didn't trust you. She decided you couldn't handle it. She took control away from you. He placed the phone back where it had been, his hands shaking despite his efforts to steady them. When she came home later, rain clinging to her coat, he was waiting, not pacing, not furious. Still, that stillness unsettled her immediately. You went to doctor without telling me, he said. His voice was calm. Too calm? Her heart dropped. She opened her mouth to explain, but memory interfered again. Her mother's quiet tears, her father's withdrawal, the way honesty had once changed the atmosphere of a room permanently. I didn't want to worry you, she said. The words sounded thin, even to her. So you lied, he replied. The word felt heavy, final. She tried to explain, tried to tell him about fear, about timing, about not wanting to burden him with uncertainty before she understood it herself. But fear shrinks language, and the more she spoke, the more he heard absence, exclusion, decision-making without him. You decided for me, he said. You decided I couldn't handle the truth. That wasn't what she had meant, but intention, she realized too late, does not erase impact. The storm returned with cruel precision. Thunder rolled through the house as if echoing the conflict inside it. Rain lashed against the windows, loud and insistent. When he told her to leave, his voice didn't shake, almost practiced. She stood there for a moment, stunned. Not because she didn't understand his pain, but because she hadn't imagined this outcome. Not like this. No. She gathered what she could, moved on instinct. Her body felt distant, as if watching from somewhere else. By the time she reached the gate, the rain had soaked through everything. She didn't cry until she was gone. What neither of them understood yet was this: that moment would become a memory they would both return to again and again, replayed, revised, reshaped by guilt and longing. For her, it would become the night honesty arrived too late. For him, the moment trust collapsed. And for both of them, it would mark the beginning, not the end, of the hardest part of the story. Separation has a strange effect on time. At first, it rushes. The hours blur together, carried forward by adrenaline and shock. But once the noise fades, time stretches. Every moment becomes noticeable, heavy, demanding to be felt. For her, the first days after the storm passed in fragments. She stayed with her friend longer than she had planned, moving carefully through borrowed space. She folded her clothes smaller than necessary, spoke softer than usual, apologized too often. Pregnancy made her tired in ways sleep couldn't fix, but rest felt undeserved somehow, as if stillness required permission she didn't have. She followed instructions, ate what she was supposed to eat, took what she was food to take. She did everything right. Still, fear remained. At night, when the house settled into unfamiliar quiet, memory returned with relentless clarity. Not just the night she was sent away, but the years leading up to it. Conversations replayed with new emphasis. Silences she had once labeled harmless now felt loud. She wondered when she had learned to disappear so gracefully, and why she had believed that love required it. She thought often about the word lied. It felt too sharp for what she had done, too final. She hadn't invented a story. She hadn't betrayed a vow. She had withheld fear. But memory, she was learning, didn't care about intent. It cared about consequence. She replayed the doctor's words again and again, wishing she had walked into the house that afternoon and spoken before fear had a chance to intervene, wishing she had trusted love to survive discomfort. Her father's voice echoed faintly in her mind. Not his words, but his absence. The way he had gone quiet when life became demanding. How she had learned to manage her fear alone so no one else would have to. She had done the same thing again. Different house, different man, same lesson. That realization hurt more than the separation itself. For him, the house became unbearable in a different way. At first, he moved through it with purpose, telling himself he was restoring order. He changed the sheets, organized drawers, threw himself into work with renewed intensity. Control, as always, felt like relief. But control is exhausting when it's driven by emotion instead of necessity. He found himself standing still in rooms, unsure why he'd gone there. Objects triggered memories he hadn't prepared for. Her mug in the sink, a note on the counter, the faint scent of lavender in the bedroom. He told himself he had done the right thing. Boundaries mattered. Trust mattered. If he allowed deception, even small deception, to go unchecked, it would set a precedent. He believed that deeply. And yet, memory betrayed him. It offered moments he had dismissed at the time. Her hesitation before speaking. The way she watched his face carefully when sharing anything uncertain. Her habit of minimizing herself, smoothing edges before he even noticed them. He realized, uncomfortably, that she had always been careful with him. That care, once flattering, now felt suspicious. Why had she felt the need? He replayed the confrontation often. Her voice, the words she chose, the way she stood, hands trembling, despite her effort to remain composed. He had focused on what she hadn't told him, but now memory insisted on showing him what she had. She hadn't defended herself aggressively. She hadn't shifted blame. She hadn't denied his pain. She had been afraid. That realization unsettled him more than anger ever could, because fear didn't fit neatly into his understanding of betrayal. Fear complicated things. Days passed without contact, not because either of them didn't want to reach out, but because neither knew how to begin. Words felt inadequate. Apologies felt premature. Silence, once again, seemed safer than saying the wrong thing. For her, each day away strengthened something fragile inside her. She began to speak more openly to her friend, to the doctor, even to herself. She admitted fear without apology, admitted exhaustion, admitted uncertainty. She noticed the relief that followed. For the first time, honesty didn't cost her connection. That mattered. For him, distance created questions he couldn't suppress. He asked himself why exclusion hurt more than fear. Why the idea of not being told felt worse than the possibility of losing control. Why love, when it asked him to stay present in uncertainty, felt unbearable. He thought about his parents, about dinners where emotions were handled efficiently, about achievements praised loudly, while discomfort passed quietly. He had learned to equate inclusion with value. Being left out felt like being unneeded. She hadn't meant to make him feel that way, but yeah. And he had responded the only way memory had taught him, by withdrawing first. Separation didn't provide answers, but it created space for questions. And in that space, both of them began to realize something difficult and necessary. The lie had not been the root of the problem. It had been the language fear used when honesty felt unsafe. Accountability is often mistaken for apology. People think it begins with words. I'm sorry. I shouldn't have. I didn't mean to. But real accountability starts earlier than that. It starts when you stop defending your version of the story long enough to see how someone else lived inside it. That was the part neither of them had learned yet. For her, guilt arrived quietly. It didn't shout, didn't accuse. It sat beside her during ordinary moments, while washing dishes, while folding laundry that now belonged in a different house, while sitting in waiting rooms with magazines she couldn't focus on. She thought about how easily the lie had slipped out of her mouth. "I'm fine." How practiced it had been. How natural. That frightened her, because it meant the lie hadn't been about him at all. It had been about who she had learned to be. She had learned to manage fear alone, to decide in advance what others could handle, to protect connection by rationing truth. She had done it with love, and still, it had hurt him. That didn't make her a villain, but it didn't make her blameless either. For the first time, she allowed herself to sit with that complexity. She began to ask herself questions she had avoided for years. When did honesty start to feel unsafe? Why did I believe fear made me unlovable? Who taught me that staying required silence? The answers weren't simple. They stretched back through memory, through childhood dinners filled with tension, through watching adults withdraw instead of confront discomfort, through learning that harmony often depended on who stayed quiet the longest. She realized she had brought those lessons into her marriage without ever questioning them. She hadn't given him the chance to stay with her fear. She had decided, without asking, that he couldn't. That realization hurt, but it also clarified something important. Silence was not neutral. It was a choice. For him, accountability arrived as resistance. At first, he rejected it outright. He reminded himself of the facts. She had gone to the doctor alone. She had withheld information. She had lied. Those were not interpretations. They were events. But memory refused to leave it there. It kept returning him to the same image, her standing in the bedroom, rain pounding outside, fear written plainly across her face. He had been right to feel hurt, but had he been right to send her away? That question lodged itself deep and refused to move. He examined his reaction with growing discomfort. Why had his first instinct been expulsion instead of conversation? Why had distance felt safer than staying present in the mess of emotion? He told himself it was about boundaries, but slowly, uncomfortably, he recognized something else beneath it. Control. When he felt powerless, he withdrew power from others. It was a pattern he knew well, even if he had never named it. He began to notice how often he equated leadership with certainty, how deeply he distrusted situations where outcomes couldn't be managed, how quickly he interpreted fear, his own or someone else's, as a threat to stability. Pregnancy had confronted him with uncertainty he couldn't solve, and instead of sitting with it, he had pushed it away. Long with her, that truth settled heavily. didn't excuse the lie, but it complicated the story he had been telling himself. Days turned into weeks. They remained apart, but something shifted in the silence between them. It no longer felt like punishment. It felt like preparation. For her, accountability meant accepting that love required risk, that protecting someone from fear might also protect them from intimacy. That honesty, even when it disrupts peace, is often the only path to real connection. For him, accountability meant admitting that trust wasn't just about being told everything. It was also about creating a space where everything could be told. He had not created that space. Not intentionally, not maliciously, but consistently. Neither of them reached out yet, not because they didn't want to, but because they were learning something essential about timing. Apologies offered too soon often protect the speaker more than the listener. Reconciliation attempted too quickly can bypass understanding. They needed clarity first. They needed to know not just what had happened, but why they had each responded the way they did. Memory, for once, was being asked to tell the truth. What neither of them knew yet was that this period, this quiet reckoning, would matter more than any dramatic reunion, because whatever came next would be shaped not by who was right or wrong, but by who was willing to change. Before we go on, take a moment and reflect. When love is hurt, who do you believe should take responsibility first? The one who stayed silent, or the one who pushed away? Share your thoughts in the comments and stay with me, because in the next chapter, we see what happens when separation becomes real. There is a particular kind of fear that arrives when you realize something might not be fixed, not broken, just finished. For her, that fear crept in slowly. At first, she told herself the separation was temporary. That space was necessary. That clarity would come, and with it, conversation. She measured time in reasonable units, days, then weeks, believing that love, once established, did not simply evaporate. But as the weeks passed, certainty dissolved. No messages, no calls, no accidental run-ins disguised as coincidence. Silence, once a tool she had used to preserve love, now became the thing threatening to erase it. She began preparing herself for an outcome she had never allowed herself to imagine, that this might be the end. Life demanded adaptation. She moved from borrowed space into something more permanent. Not a home, not yet, but a place that belonged to her alone. She arranged furniture carefully, unconsciously recreating order the way she always had. Control, even in small doses, felt grounding. Pregnancy appointments continued. She attended them alone. At first, the loneliness stung sharply. She felt the absence in waiting rooms filled with couples, in the way nurses asked questions meant for two people. But gradually, something else emerged beneath the sadness. Competence. She learned how to ask questions without apology, how to voice concerns clearly, how to sit with uncertainty without immediately shrinking away from it. Each time she spoke honestly and wasn't abandoned, something inside her loosened. She began to realize how much of her life had been shaped by the fear of being left, and how often that fear had dictated her behavior. This time, no one left. That mattered more than she expected. For him, the realization came differently. At first, separation felt like relief. The tension had disappeared. The house was quiet again, predictable. He threw himself into work with precision, filling his days with meetings, decisions, outcomes, things he could influence. He told himself this was better. But at night, when the structure of the day fell away, unease crept in. He found himself thinking in conditional phrases. If she were here, if things had gone differently, those thoughts unsettled him because they implied regret, and regret suggested responsibility. He had always believed that decisive action prevented long-term damage, that drawing firm lines protected against erosion. But now, alone in the silence he had chosen, he wondered whether firmness had cost him more than it had preserved. He avoided certain rooms. The bedroom remained mostly untouched, as if acknowledging it might require him to acknowledge everything else. The scent of lavender lingered faintly, a reminder he had not intended to keep. One evening, he opened the drawer again. Baby clothes were still there, folded carefully, precisely as if waiting. That was when it happened. Not a dramatic collapse, not tears, just a quiet realization that stopped him mid-motion. She had been preparing for a future he had abruptly interrupted. She had been planning, hoping, imagining, while he had been bracing, guarding, anticipating loss. They had been facing the same moment from opposite directions. He began to imagine a life where she didn't come back. It unsettled him more than he expected, not because he doubted his ability to function, but because he questioned whether function was enough, whether success, control, and order could compensate for the absence of someone who had brought softness into his world. He thought about the child, about the responsibility he had pushed away in a moment of pain. That thought lingered longer than the rest. For her, imagining life without him was painful, but strangely clarifying. She missed him. That truth didn't change. But she also noticed how much energy she now had, how her thoughts felt less constrained, how fear no longer dictated every interaction. She wondered who she might become if she stopped managing herself to fit someone else's comfort. The question frightened her. It also intrigued her. Both of them were learning something essential. Though neither had named it yet, love cannot survive on intention alone. It requires emotional safety. Not just honesty, but the assurance that honesty will be met with presence instead of punishment. Whether they would be able to build that together was still uncertain. What was certain was this: if reconciliation came, it could not be built on the same foundation as before. And if it did not come, both of them would carry this lesson forward into whatever life awaited them next. Avoidance only works when time feels unlimited. It depends on the belief that there will always be another day to explain, another chance to repair, another moment when the words will come more easily. But distance has a way of making time feel finite. For both of them, that realization arrived quietly and almost simultaneously. For her, it came during an appointment she nearly canceled. She had woken that morning exhausted, her body heavy, her mind crowded with the familiar debate. What difference does it make? She had grown used to doing everything alone now. Independence had become routine, but something inside her insisted she go. The waiting room was full. Conversations drifted around her, plans, complaints, laughter. She listened without really hearing, her hand resting on her stomach out of habit rather than fear. When the nurse asked a question meant for a partner, "Will someone be joining you today?" she answered without hesitation, "No." The word surprised her with its steadiness. That didn't sound like loss. It sounded like truth. Later, driving home, she felt an unfamiliar calm settle over her. Not happiness, not relief, just clarity. She could do this not because she wanted to, but because she had learned how. That realization carried an unexpected weight, because it meant reaching out to him could no longer be about survival. It would have to be about choice, and choice required honesty. For him, the moment arrived late at night. He had stayed up working longer than usual, chasing the familiar comfort of productivity. The house was silent, except for the low hum of electronics and the distant sound of rain beginning again. Rain had started to mean something to him now. He closed his laptop and leaned back, rubbing his eyes. Fatigue pressed in, not physical exhaustion, but the kind that comes from holding unresolved tension for too long. His phone sat untouched on the desk. He had checked it more often than he cared to admit, not because he expected a message, but because part of him feared missing one. He told himself he was waiting for her to reach out, that if she wanted reconciliation, she would say so, that he had already made his position clear. But honesty, when it finally arrived, was blunt. He was afraid to be the one who spoke first, afraid that reaching out would mean admitting he might have been wrong, afraid that it would reopen emotions he had worked hard to contain, afraid that he wouldn't know how to handle what came next. Avoidance, he realized, was not neutrality. D was a decision, and it was one he had made repeatedly. That night, he stood in the doorway of the spare room, now empty, untouched since the storm. He hadn't planned to go there. His body had taken him there without instruction. He imagined her standing there weeks ago, packing in silence, trying to remain composed while her world shifted beneath her feet. The image unsettled him. He had believed distance would give him control. Instead, it had given him doubt. For days, neither of them acted. But something had changed. The silence no longer felt protective. It felt intentional. And intention, once recognized, carries responsibility. She sat at her small kitchen table one evening, phone in hand, considering what reaching out would mean. Not just practically, but emotionally. She could not apologize for being afraid. She could apologize for not trusting him with that fear. She could acknowledge the hurt without minimizing her own experience, but only if he was willing to hear it. She realized with surprising calm that she could survive either outcome. That knowledge steadied her. Across the city, he stared at the same device, wrestling with a different version of the same truth. If he reached out, it would mean accepting that trust was not enforced. It was built. That boundaries drawn without dialogue could become punishments. That strength did not always look like decisiveness. It might mean learning to stay when everything in him wanted to withdraw. He wasn't sure he knew how to do that yet, but he was certain of one thing. If he did nothing, the distance would become permanent. Choice, when it finally arrives, rarely announces itself. It waits until all excuses are exhausted, until avoidance no longer feels safe, until silence starts to look like loss. For both of them, that moment had arrived. And what came next? One message, one conversation, one decision would determine whether memory remained a wound, became a bridge. Reconnection rarely begins with confidence. It begins with hesitation, with the awareness that whatever you say next cannot be unsaid. That reaching out does not guarantee relief. It only guarantees vulnerability. She stared at her phone longer than she meant to. The message field was empty, but her mind wasn't. Words came in fragments, rose to the surface, then retreated again. Apologies tangled with explanations. Fear pressed against resolve. She didn't want to reopen wounds carelessly. She didn't want to sound defensive. She didn't want to beg. Most of all, she didn't want to disappear again. She placed one hand on her stomach, grounding herself in the present. The baby shifted faintly, a reminder that this moment, this choice, mattered beyond pride. She typed slowly, "I don't know if you're ready to talk. I understand if you're not, but I think it's time I stopped being quiet." She read it twice, then once more. It felt honest, not complete, but honest enough to begin. She sent it before fear could revise it into silence. When his phone buzzed, he didn't pick it up right away. He knew who it was. He had imagined this moment too many times not to recognize the weight of it. He took a breath, then another, steadying himself the way he always had before difficult conversations. Control first, emotion later. But the message didn't accuse, didn't Ted, didn't demand. It acknowledged choice. That unsettled him. He read it once, then again. She wasn't asking him to forgive her. She wasn't minimizing what had happened. She was simply refusing to stay silent anymore. Something inside him loosened. He realized in that moment that part of what had hurt him most wasn't the omission itself. It was the feeling of being shut out of her inner world, of being managed instead of trusted. This message felt like an opening, not a solution, an opening. He didn't reply immediately, not because he didn't want to, but because he wanted to respond with intention, not reflex. He sat with the discomfort of that pause, resisting the urge to craft something perfect. Perfection had never helped before. He typed, "I don't know what I'm ready for, but I'm willing to talk." It was short, honest, incomplete. Enough. They met in a small cafe. Neither of them had strong associations with a neutral space that didn't carry memory yet. The kind of place you choose when you don't know what you're walking into. She arrived early. Old habits surfaced immediately. She chose a table near the wall, positioned her chair carefully, wrapped both hands around her cup, though she hadn't taken a sip. When he walked in, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest. But it was different now. Less panic, more awareness. They looked at each other for a moment, longer than necessary. Neither smiled right away. That mattered. Conversation didn't start easily. They spoke about neutral things first. The weather, schedules, practicalities. Words that felt safe, if meaningless. Each sentence was a test. Each pause an assessment. Finally, she exhaled. "I was afraid," she said. No qualifiers. No defenses. Just truth. He didn't interrupt. That alone surprised her. "I didn't lie to control anything," she continued. "I lied because I thought fear would make me harder to love. And I didn't want to lose you." The words trembled slightly, but she didn't pull them back. He nodded slowly. "I didn't hear fear," he said after a moment. "I heard exclusion, and I reacted to that." He paused, searching for language he wasn't used to using. "I felt unnecessary. And when I feel that way, I shut down." Silence followed, but it wasn't hostile. It was attentive. This wasn't reconciliation. No apologies had been accepted yet. No promises made. But something important was happening. They were listening, not to respond, not to defend, but to understand. For the first time, memory wasn't narrating the conversation for them. They were present, and presence, they were beginning to realize, was the thing they had both been missing all along. The cafe grew louder as time passed. More people arrived. Chairs scraped against the floor. Cups clinked. But inside, the space between them, something had gone quiet in a different way. Focused. Intent. They were no longer skirting the truth. They were sitting inside it. She spoke slowly now, choosing honesty over polish. "I've spent my whole life believing that fear makes people leave," she said. "So when I'm afraid, I try to make myself easier to stay with. I didn't even realize I was doing it anymore. He listened without interruption, without the tightening posture she had learned to read so well. I didn't think I was taking something from you, she continued. I thought I was protecting us. I know, he said quietly. That answer surprised her. He leaned back slightly, eyes dropping to the table before lifting again. I don't experience fear that way. When I don't know what's happening, when I'm not included, I feel like I don't matter, like I'm already being left behind. He hesitated, then added, that feeling makes me want to regain control, and when I can't, I create distance. Hearing him say it, name it, shifted something in her chest. This wasn't the man from the storm. This, someone learning to stay. They sat with that truth for a moment. No one rushed to fix it. She realized how unfamiliar that felt. I should have trusted you with my fear, she said, even if it scared you, even if it changed things. He nodded, and I should have made it clear that fear wouldn't make me leave. That honesty, even messy honesty, was welcome. He paused. I didn't do that. There was no defensiveness in his voice. No justification. Just acknowledgement. That mattered more than apology. She looked at him then. Really looked. The lines of tension around his eyes. The restraint he wore, like armor. She wondered how many times he had chosen control over closeness, because closeness felt like something that could be taken away, almost without thinking. She said his name. Ethan. The sound of it landed differently now. He looked up, startled, not because of the name itself, but because of how it was spoken. Carefully, without fear, with expectation. No one had said his name like that in a long time. He swallowed. And when he said hers, Lena, it wasn't with frustration or distance. It with recognition. Her chest tightened. Names, she realized, were more than labels. They were permissions. Invitations? Proof that you were being seen as a person again, not a problem to be solved. They didn't promise anything that day. They talked about the pregnancy, honestly, for the first time without filtering. She told him what the doctor had, what she was afraid of, what she didn't know yet. He didn't try to solve it. He asked questions instead. That knew. He admitted how powerless the situation made him feel, how deeply he feared being excluded, not just from decisions, but from emotional truth. They acknowledged the damage without pretending it would disappear overnight. Trust, they agreed, wouldn't return because of one conversation. But it could begin there. When they stood to leave, neither of them rushed. Outside, the rain had stopped. The pavement glistened, reflecting a sky that wasn't clear, but lighter. They walked a short distance together, not touching, not avoiding it either. This doesn't fix everything, she said. I know, he replied, but it changes something. Yes, he said. It does. They stopped at the corner where they would part. No embrace, no promise, just a shared understanding that whatever came next would have to be built differently, on honesty that didn't require perfection and closeness that didn't depend on control. As they walked away from each other, memory followed. But this time, it wasn't rewriting the past. It was making room for something new. Repair does not feel romantic, doesn't arrive with certainty or relief. It shows up as effort, repetitive, imperfect, and often uncomfortable. It asks for consistency when emotion would rather retreat. That was the season they entered next. Not reconciliation, practice. They didn't move back in together. That decision was intentional. They both understood now how easily closeness could become avoidance, how quickly routine could replace reflection. Distance, used carefully, gave them space to choose each other deliberately instead of sliding back into old patterns. They met regularly, but not constantly. Coffee once a week, walks that ended before fatigue turned into irritability, conversations that stopped when emotions grew too heavy to manage well. At first, it felt awkward, like learning a new language with someone who knew your old one too well. But something else was happening beneath the discomfort. They were paying attention. Ethan learned how often his instinct was to fix. When Lena spoke about fear, about the pregnancy, about uncertainty, he noticed how quickly solutions rose to the surface of his mind. Suggestions, plans, safeguards. Each one felt helpful. Each one, he was learning, could also be a way of leaving. So he practiced staying still. He asked questions instead of offering answers. He resisted the urge to reassure prematurely. He listened past the point where he felt uncomfortable. It wasn't natural. Deliberate. Lena learned how often her instinct was to soften truth before speaking it. She noticed how easily she minimized, how reflexively she added qualifiers, reassurances, disclaimers designed to make her fear easier to receive. She practiced saying what she felt plainly, not dramatically, not apologetically, just honestly. I'm scared today. I don't know what I need yet. I feel overwhelmed, and I don't want to disappear. Each sentence felt like a risk. Each one was met with presence instead of withdrawal. That mattered. There were setbacks, moments when Ethan withdrew too quickly, retreating into silence when uncertainty pressed too hard, moments when Lena reverted to old habits, choosing peace over truth without realizing she'd done it. But now, those moments were noticed, named. They talked about them afterward, not to assign blame, but to understand the pattern as it happened. That was new, too. One afternoon, they sat in the park, watching children run across the grass. Lena's hand rested on her stomach, protective without fear. She spoke quietly, more to herself than to him. I used to think love meant Never making someone uncomfortable, she said. Now I'm starting to think it means trusting them with discomfort. Ethan nodded. I used to think love meant always being in control, he replied. Now I'm realizing control kept me from being present. They sat with that for a while. No urgency, no pressure to conclude anything. Growth, they were learning, didn't require resolution on a schedule. The pregnancy progressed. Appointments continued, this time together. He didn't hover. She didn't minimize. They listened to information side by side, sharing concern without rushing to contain it. When fear surfaced, it was acknowledged instead of managed away. Not every appointment was easy, but none of them were lonely. Memory still appeared. Old reflexes still whispered. But now, when memory tried to narrate the moment, they paused and asked a different question. What is actually happening right now? That question changed everything. Repair was not dramatic. It was slow, but it was real. And slowly, something began to grow. Not just trust, but confidence in their ability to face discomfort together. Not perfectly, but honestly. Growth does not erase instinct. It coexists with it. Even as they practiced honesty and presence, old habits waited patiently in the background, ready to return the moment stress rose or certainty slipped. And stress did rise. The pregnancy brought new information. Not catastrophic, but serious enough to unsettle the fragile equilibrium they had built. Monitoring increased. Appointments became more frequent. Language grew more cautious. Fear resurfaced, not as panic, but as pressure. For Lena, the pressure revived an old impulse. She began editing again. Not entirely, just enough to feel safe. She noticed herself choosing words that sounded calmer than she felt, offering reassurance she wasn't fully convinced of. She caught it. This time, that mattered. But catching a pattern doesn't make it disappear. For Ethan, uncertainty stirred a familiar response. He found himself researching late into the night, assembling contingency plans, calculating outcomes. Knowledge, once again, felt like control, and control felt like safety. But it also felt isolating. He caught himself deciding things internally before discussing them with her. Not to dominate, but to protect, to be ready. He recognized the pattern. That mattered too, but recognition alone wasn't enough. The tension surfaced during an appointment. The doctor spoke carefully, outlining next steps with practiced calm. Lena listened closely, her body still, her mind racing. Ethan asked questions, precise, informed, controlled. Afterward, in the parking lot, silence stretched longer than it should have. You already knew some of that, Lena said quietly. Ethan didn't deny it. I wanted to be prepared. Her chest tightened. That's how it starts, she said. You preparing alone? He flinched, not defensively, but with recognition. And you, he replied gently, were already deciding how to keep me from worrying. They stood there for a moment, the truth uncomfortably clear between them. This was the test, not whether they would feel the pull of old habits, but whether they would name them before they took over. Lena took a breath. I'm scared, she said, and part of me still thinks if I show that too clearly, you'll pull away. Ethan swallowed, and part of me still thinks if I don't stay ahead of everything, I'll lose control and be pushed out. They looked at each other, not as adversaries, but as people sharing the same fear from opposite directions. Something softened. I don't want to do this the old way, she said. Neither do I, he replied. That was all. No argument, no withdrawal, just awareness and choice. That night, fear lingered. Growth hadn't erased it, but neither had retreated. They spoke later, on the phone, about small things, ordinary things, not to avoid the bigger ones, but to remind themselves that connection didn't have to collapse under pressure. Memory tried to intrude, offering worst-case scenarios, replaying past failures. But this time, memory didn't get the final word. They interrupted it with presence. Progress they were learning wasn't linear. Waver, doubled back, required constant attention. But the difference now was this. They were no longer alone inside it. And that made all the difference. There is a point in repair when effort becomes habit. Not because everything is healed, but because something steadier has taken root. A willingness, a recognition that the work itself is meaningful, even when the outcome remains uncertain. That was where they found themselves now. Not reconciled in the way people expect. Not broken in the way people fear. Just present. They began spending longer stretches of time together again. Not out of urgency, but out of comfort. An afternoon here, a shared meal there. Ordinary moments reclaimed carefully, as if both of them were aware of how easily routine could slip back into avoidance. They talked more freely now, but not endlessly. Silence still existed between them, but it no longer felt like absence. It felt like rest. Lena noticed how different it felt to sit beside him without bracing herself, to speak without rehearsing, to pause without apologizing. She didn't feel fearless. She felt allowed. That distinction mattered. Ethan noticed something too. How much energy he had once spent maintaining control. How exhausting it had been to anticipate every possible outcome. How unfamiliar, but relieving. It felt to admit uncertainty without immediately trying to neutralize it. He didn't feel weak. He felt honest. That also mattered. One evening, they cooked together for the first time since the separation. The kitchen was smaller than he remembered. Or maybe it just felt that way now that memory wasn't distorting it. They moved around each other carefully at first, relearning space and rhythm. Lena chopped vegetables slowly, deliberately. Ethan handled the stove. "You know," he said after a moment, "I used to think commitment meant never doubting the decision you made." She glanced up. "And now? And now I think it means choosing the same person, even when doubt shows up." She considered that. "I used to think commitment meant never causing discomfort," she said. "Now I think it means trusting someone enough to let them see it." They shared a quiet look, nod agreement, understanding. The conversation turned, eventually, to the future, not in sweeping terms, no declarations, just questions. What would living together again look like, if it happened at all? What boundaries would need to exist? What fears still felt unresolved? They didn't rush to answers. They allowed uncertainty to remain part of the conversation instead of treating it like a problem to solve. That was new territory for both of them. Lena spoke about the pregnancy with clarity now, not just the facts, but the emotions. The days she felt strong, the days fear resurfaced, the moments when she still worried she might be too much. Ethan listened. He didn't reassure her prematurely. He didn't minimize the risk. He didn't withdraw. He stayed. That alone felt like commitment. Later that night, after he left, Lena sat alone for a while, reflecting. She realized something quietly, without drama. She no longer needed him to stay in order to feel whole. She wanted him to stay. The difference felt profound. Across the city, Ethan experienced a similar realization. He could imagine a life without her, and he didn't like it. Not because he feared failure, but because he valued what they were building now. Not certainty, commitment. They were learning. Wasn't a promise to never hurt each other. It was a promise to stay present when hurt appeared, to listen instead of withdraw, to speak instead of manage, to choose connection over protection. That choice didn't eliminate risk, but it made the risk worthwhile. Decisions don't always arrive with certainty. Sometimes they come quietly, without celebration, without the confidence people expect. They come as acknowledgments of limits, of growth, of what is now possible, even if the future remains unclear. That was the kind of decision they faced. They sat across from each other one evening, the light low, the room unremarkable. It wasn't a setting designed for life-altering choices. That somehow felt right. Lena spoke first. "I don't want to go back to how things were," she said. "Even if it be easier." Ethan nodded. "Neither do I." Silence followed, but not the kind that avoided truth. The kind that made space for it. "I don't know exactly what this looks like yet," she continued. "I just know I don't want to build anything that requires me to disappear. He absorbed that fully before answering. And I don't want to build anything that depends on control, he said. I don't want fear to decide for me anymore. Those words felt like a line drawn, not between them, but behind them. They talked about logistics, but gently. Living arrangements, not immediately, not impulsively. Support during the pregnancy, present, consistent, shared. Boundaries, spoken this time, not assumed. They didn't rush reconciliation. They chose responsibility instead. Ethan committed to showing up, not just physically, but emotionally, to asking before deciding, to staying present, even when uncertainty pressed hard against him. Lena committed to speaking fear when it appeared, not after it had been softened or managed away, to trusting that honesty didn't automatically lead to abandonment. Neither framed these commitments as vows. They were practices. Later, as Ethan prepared to leave, he paused near the door. "This still scares me," he admitted. She smiled softly. "Me too." But there was no urge to fix that fear. No need to pretend bravery. They stood there for a moment, close but not clinging. "We'll take it step by step," she said. He nodded. Together, it wasn't a promise of permanence. It was a promise of presence. That night, memory visited again, but it felt different now. It didn't replay the storm with the same intensity. It didn't accuse or defend. It observed. Memory, she realized, didn't have to be erased to lose its power. It just had to be understood. For Ethan, memory softened too. The image of her in the rain still existed, but now it was accompanied by another, her sitting across from him, speaking fear plainly, trusting him to stay. That mattered. It reframed everything. They didn't move back in together right away. They didn't announce anything. Life continued. Appointments, preparations, ordinary days shaped by effort rather than avoidance. But something essential had changed. They were no longer reacting to the past. They were responding to the present. And that was enough for now. Some endings don't arrive with closure. They arrive with understanding. That was what happened first. The final weeks of the pregnancy unfolded slowly, deliberately, as if time itself had softened. Appointments continued. Conversations deepened. The future remained undefined, but no longer frightening in the same way. Lena noticed how different fear felt now. It still appeared, still tightened her chest on certain mornings, still whispered doubts late at night. But it no longer isolated her. She spoke it aloud when it surfaced, sometimes clumsily, sometimes with tears, sometimes with quiet honesty. And Ethan stayed. Not perfectly, not without effort, but he stayed. He learned to sit beside uncertainty without immediately trying to outrun it. He learned that presence didn't require solutions, that listening was not passivity, that staying emotionally available was a form of strength he had never practiced before. There were moments when old instincts flared, when he felt the urge to take control, to decide ahead of time, to protect himself from the discomfort of not knowing. And each time he paused. "What do you need right now?" he asked instead. Sometimes she had an answer. Sometimes she didn't. Both were acceptable. They didn't erase the past. They referenced it occasionally, carefully, without accusation. They acknowledged the storm as something that had happened, something that had mattered, something that had changed them. But it no longer defined every interaction. Memory had loosened its grip. One afternoon, they sat together assembling a crib. The room was modest, not the nursery they had once imagined, not the grand vision that had been interrupted. But it was enough. The pieces lay scattered on the floor, instructions unfolded between them. Ethan studied the diagrams carefully. Lena laughed softly. "You're overthinking it," he smiled. "Probably." They worked in silence for a while, passing tools back and forth. There was no rush, no tension, just cooperation. At one point, Ethan stopped and looked around the room. "This doesn't look how I pictured it," he said. "No," Lena agreed. "But it feels more real." He nodded. That felt right as the due date approached. The question of what they were lingered quietly between them. They didn't label it. They didn't need to. Commitment now looked different than it once had. It wasn't defined by shared space or declarations. It was defined by behavior, by consistency, by honesty, by the willingness to remain emotionally present even when things felt unfinished. That kind of commitment felt sturdier. The night Lena went into labor, it was raining again. Not violently, not dramatically, just a steady rhythm against the windows, familiar and unthreatening. Ethan was there. When fear rose, he didn't leave the room. When pain intensified, he didn't retreat into efficiency. He stayed present, sometimes quiet, sometimes uncertain, but always there. Lena noticed that more than anything else. She wasn't managing herself anymore. Hours later, when everything slowed and the room settled into a new kind of stillness, Lena looked at Ethan and felt something she hadn't expected. Not triumph, not relief, understanding. They had both failed in ways that mattered. They had both grown in ways that mattered more. This moment didn't erase the past. It reframed it. As dawn approached, light filtering softly through the window, Lena thought about memory again, how it once warned her that fear made people leave, and how wrong that lesson had been. Fear didn't make people leave. Silence did. The room was quiet in the way only early mornings know how to be. Not empty, not tense, just still. Lena lay back against the pillows, exhausted in a way that felt earned rather than depleted. The weight of the night lingered in her body, but something else lingered too, a softness she hadn't felt in a long time. Ethan stood near the window, the first light of morning catching the edges of his face. He hadn't slept. He didn't feel the need to. For the first time in years, his mind wasn't racing ahead, trying to predict what might go wrong next. It was here, fully present. They didn't speak right away. Words felt unnecessary in this moment, and neither of them felt the urge to fill the silence. That alone told them how much had changed. Eventually, Ethan turned. "You did that?" he said quietly. Lena smiled faintly. "We did?" He nodded. That mattered. Later, when the room had emptied and the world felt smaller again, they talked. Not about the future, not about reconciliation, not about what came next. They talked about what had already happened. "I used to believe that if I didn't stay in control, everything would fall apart," Ethan said. "I thought certainty was what kept people close." He paused, choosing honesty over comfort. "But control just kept me alone." Lena listened without interrupting. "I used to believe that fear made me unlovable," she said. If I showed it, I'd be left." She looked at him then. "So I tried to be easy, quiet, manageable." She swallowed, "And I lost myself doing that." Neither of them flinched from the truth. They had learned, finally, that love didn't require erasing fear or mastering it. It required sharing it. They didn't make promises that morning. Not about forever. Not about never failing again. Not about getting everything right. They had learned how dangerous those promises could be. Instead, they spoke about practices, about asking instead of assuming, about staying when discomfort appeared, about noticing old patterns before they took over, about choosing presence again and again, even when it was hard, especially when it was hard. Weeks later, life settled into a new rhythm. Not the old one, a different one. They lived separately for a while longer, not out of punishment or distance, but intention. They wanted space for what they were building now, space to choose each other without slipping back into habit. Ethan showed up consistently, not perfectly, but honestly. Lena spoke openly, not fearlessly, but truthfully. They disagreed sometimes, misunderstood each other occasionally. Old instincts still surfaced. But now, when they did, neither of them panicked. They talked. They stayed. Memory still visited, but it no longer ruled them. The storm became just that, a storm, a moment that revealed what needed to change instead of something that defined who they were. Lena no longer remembered it as the night she was abandoned. She remembered it as the night silence stopped protecting her. Ethan no longer remembered it as betrayal. He remembered it as the moment he learned the difference between boundaries and punishment. One evening, months later, they sat together, watching the quiet rise and fall of a sleeping child. Lena rested her head lightly against Ethan's shoulder. "This still isn't perfect," she said. He smiled, gently. "No, but it's real." "Yes," he said, "it is." And for the first time in their lives, neither of them needed more than that. Because love, they had learned, isn't proven by never breaking. It's proven by what you after, by whether you're willing to listen instead of retreat, to speak instead of hide, to stay present when fear shows up. Not once, but over and over again. And that quiet understanding, earned, imperfect, and honest, was enough to carry them forward. If this story stayed with you, if it made you reflect on how fear, silence, and love show up in your own life, leave a comment and share what this story taught you. And if you believe love stories should be honest, healing, and real, subscribe to Love Stories by Mr. Johnson for more stories like this. Thank you for staying until the end.